I'd like to welcome you to the new school and to welcome you to the Institute for Retired Professionals Friday at 1 series. We are a group that has been at the new school for 50 years, where we have been serious students after our work careers. I'm really pleased to welcome you here, and you can find out a great deal about our program by leaving your name on the way out. I'm going to make the traditional announcement of saying, please turn off your cell phones. And now I'm going to invite a student in the program who left a neighboring college where she worked for many, many years to become a student at the new school and a student at the IRP. She's a member of our speakers committee, and she will introduce today's speaker, Jane Osmer.
I'm going to introduce Fabio Parasecoli. Fabio Parasecoli is an associate professor. Fabio Parasecoli is an associate professor here at the new school. He is the professor in the Food Studies program. His research focuses on the intersection among food, media, and politics. Currently, his research is aimed at food and masculinity in movies and the social political aspects of geographical indicators. He studied East Asian cultures and political science in Rome, Naples, and Beijing, where he specialized in contemporary Chinese history. Among his recent publications, he has Food Culture in Italy, Introduction to Culinary Cultures in Europe, and a new book, a book from 2008, Bite Me, and it's about food and political culture. He's currently working with another editor, with Peter Scoliers, on a volume, Cultural History of Food, and that will be available sometime in the end of 2011. We are pleased to welcome Fabio Parasecoli.
Hello, everybody. I would like to thank the Institute for Retired Professionals to invite me for this talk. I'm actually excited about it. I'm always excited. I should take the microphone closer or raise it. I cannot raise it from here. Can you hear? Is it better? Or maybe I just grab it. All right. Now it works? All right. How about, okay. So thank you for the invitation. And I'd like also to show the book. This is Bite Me, Food in Popular Culture. And it's the result of a few years of work and research on how food is represented in pop culture and media. So what we're going to do today, we're going to discuss a little bit the topic in general, and then we're going to see how what we have discussed can be applied to analyze and better understand pieces of pop culture that we can see on TV, at the movies, on the bus, and wherever we find ourselves. I found the topic of pop culture particularly interesting. It's a very complicated concept because how do you define popular culture? Is it popular as opposed to what? Who defines what's popular? Who defines what's not popular, hence serious culture or high culture or highbrow culture, as somebody likes to call it? So is there an authority, a center of power that determines what falls into the canon of real culture and what ends up being in the container of pop culture? These are actually very, very big questions, and many scholars in media and communication and cultural studies are actually pointing to the fact that there is increasingly blurred border between what was before considered high culture and what was considered low culture. So it's extremely complicated to put your finger on what is pop culture. Is it, can it include the traditions, popular traditions, folklore, or it's something different. So there is a lot of discussion about that, actually, within different fields of research. But in food studies, we have this multidisciplinary approach. So in a way, we are in a better position to look at food in all its aspects. We are not tied to media studies or cultural studies or film studies or literary studies or gender studies. We can focus on food and take what we need to examine what we're looking at, which is, it works fine. What's going on? Oh, no food and drink. Oh, okay. This is actually a good piece of pop culture right now. So what is pop culture? I'd like to start the conversation from the source of pop culture, Wikipedia, which, as you might know, students love to quote in papers, and we try to make them understand how can they quote it and what Wikipedia is, but it's extremely complicated. Anyway, so what's pop culture in Wikipedia? Popular culture, commonly known as pop culture, is the totality of ideas, perspectives, attitudes, images, and other phenomena that are deemed preferred per an informal consensus within the mainstream of a given culture, especially Western culture of the early to mid-20th century, and the emerging global mainstream of the late 20th and early 21st century. Heavily influenced by mass media, this collection of ideas permeates the everyday lives of the society. So this is their definition of popular culture in general. I'd like to start by discussing some elements in this definition, and I think it will help us to get where we'll discuss food. They say pop culture is the totality of ideas, perspective, attitudes, images, and other phenomena. It's very interesting that they mention this totality. I think this aspect is very important. For the reasons I mentioned before, it's difficult to break popular culture down into sectors. It doesn't make sense, at least from my point of view, to separate food in media from food that you find in the supermarket, from food and way of consuming meals in a restaurant, from food and political problems and global trade. All these things are very much connected. So when we look at food, at popular culture, we have to look at it as a totality. We cannot break it down. We cannot separate films from advertising, from videos, from CDs, from music, from design. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Sometimes it's done for research purposes, but I think from a theoretical but also very practical point of view, this approach has its limitations. The definition also includes in the totality ideas, perspectives, attitude, images, and it gives the highest relevance to mass media. I cannot but agree on these points. But I think this definition, and it's very often the problem when dealing with pop culture, this definition forgets two very important aspects: material culture and practices. Now, you realize how important that is for food. We can talk about ideas, attitudes, narratives, discourses, but then we have to go down to food. Food is material, and it's extremely important in its materiality. Food has the power of influencing our life because we become what we ingest. That's pretty clear. I mean, Feuerbach said it at the beginning of the 19th century, so did Brillat-Savarin, you are what you eat. It's sort of a trope, but if you think about it, it really makes sense. And that creates lots of important connections between us as individual, as parts of collective, parts of communities, and what we ingest. In the moment that we ingest something, we open up our borders. We sort of renounce the fact that we're self-contained, we're one thing, we are one person, and the world comes inside us. Needless to say, there are lots of psychological implications in this, and psychoanalytical too. But this won't be the topic of my talk today. But these practices, this material culture, permeates every aspect of society precisely because food is part of our daily life. We cannot just eliminate it from our lives. So we have to add all the linguistic phenomenon, but also material life, practices. As a matter of fact, now there is some interest in looking at these things as possible tools for rhetorics. Sometimes my accent slips out, but I hope you understand. So what's rhetorics? It's persuading, right? It's trying to get an argument through. Usually we think of rhetorics in terms of words, of sentences, of speeches. But actually, you can convince people to do things, and you can sort of shape their perceptions, their way of being, through material aspects of their lives, through their practices. There is a whole field of research called embodiment, which I think is very important. How do we live our bodies? We usually don't think about that too much. Either we think of it in terms of nutrition. What do we need to eat to be healthy? We might think of it in cultural terms, but the fact that we inhabit our bodies and we construct our world around the way we live our body is extremely important. And food plays a huge role in this sort of connection. This element of the body practices has been very present at least since the 30s. There is this French anthropologist called Marcel Mauss, M-A-U-S-S, who wrote a piece called The Techniques of the Body. And he pointed out how all the daily actions, the way you sit, the way you talk, the way you walk, the way you sleep, are not just natural. There's no such thing as natural. They're based on biological dynamics, but they're highly cultural. In food, that's very easy to understand. Some cultures eat with their hands. Some cultures eat with forks. Some cultures eat while sitting on the floor, standing. Here, when I came to the US, I was quite surprised to see people eating and walking, actually running toward the train at the same time, which was something that I was not exposed to where I come from. So there are lots of things that appear as natural because we've been enculturated into them for so long that we don't perceive it as something different from who we are. And we lose the perspective about this. So it's important to keep that in mind. Another important sociologist in the 80s was actually a Jesuit priest, Michel de Certeau, who worked in France. He focused a lot on daily practices. He wrote about shopping, he wrote about cooking, and he discusses how we actually negotiate our daily actions in terms of tactics within a field that is very often determined by bigger powers. I mean, when you go shopping, you very often find yourself in a supermarket. And what's in the supermarket and how the supermarket is laid out and where things are in the supermarket are not there by chance. I mean, everything has got a very specific goal. And if you shop in a supermarket, you know what I'm talking about, right? You have the fresh stuff outside and then all the sort of more processed stuff inside. There are certain things positioned in your eye level. There are certain things positioned at the end of the aisles. So Desserteau thought that's the strategy of those who hold the power in that space. As individuals, we can tactically negotiate the way we navigate the supermarket. Who says that we decide to start shopping from the end of the supermarket? Or we decide that for a couple of days we will get nothing frozen. So, but to do that, you sort of have to think about it. Otherwise, you would naturally be led to follow the structure of the supermarket. And that happens in restaurants. We know that when you go to a restaurant, you're supposed to wait for somebody to seat you or sit yourself if you're allowed to, and then you have a waiter, and then you order. These things seem so natural that when we go to other places, in other cultures, we realize that it's not so natural. And also when our way of eating goes abroad, is perceived as non-natural. When McDonald's opened in China, the Chinese didn't know what to do with it. I mean, for us, it's normal that you walk to a counter and you have images and you point at what you want, and then you wait for somebody to serve you, and there is a line, and then you sit down, you eat, and you leave. That was so contrary to whatever was available in China back in the 80s that people really didn't know what space was that. Even the relationship in the space, the way we eat in the space, is not natural. It's really very much culturally determined. The Wikipedia definitions also talk about the mainstream. And that's a very interesting topic. What's mainstream? I mean, this country has lived through different, cultural wars. How can you define the mainstream? Is it possible to define mainstream? Many theorists refuse that and think that we should approach societies in terms of subcultures. And when it comes to food, it would make sense. Think about New York. New York as a city, in its foodways, is completely different, let's say, from, Trenton, New Jersey, which is pretty close. And within New York, you have so many subcultures. You have the people that go to the green market. You have the food deserts in the Bronx. You have the foodies. You have the dumpster divers. You have all this sort of way. You're familiar with the dumpster divers, right? Okay. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, there was a sketch on Portlandia on the FIC that was really funny about a couple of dumpster divers that organized a whole party for friends using garbage. That show has got lots of funny jabs at contemporary food culture and contemporary food trends. There was another scene where they're sitting in the restaurant, and the restaurant, it's all honest, and they talk about the chicken, and of course on the menu there is the farm where the chicken is raised. And then they start talking to the waitress to get more information about the chicken. How old is she? Was she fine? Was she happy where she was? And eventually they decide to jump on the car and go to the farm and talk to the farmers, leaving the waitress with, the menu in her hands. Eventually they end up becoming part of a cult in the countryside. It becomes sort of weird, but it's quite funny. But think about that. I mean, what's the mainstream in New York? Is it possible to say? I mean, it's the foodie world or it's the diner world? It is the world of the Mexican cantina or what? I mean, it's extremely complicated, and this is one of the elements that pop culture has to deal with. We could go on and on and on, but I'd like to start showing you a few pieces, snippets from pop culture, and see how food is represented. Keep in mind that we cannot separate those representations in the media from practices and material culture. So we're looking at just one aspect of what food in pop culture is. But already looking at this, you can realize how much food and its representations and the way it's practiced can affect the way you perceive yourself as an individual, as a member of a community, in terms of gender, class, race, and all elements. So I've decided to focus on a specific American institution, which is the diner. It has already a very interesting history in itself. It's something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world as an institution. It's a place where you have those menus that are, I don't know, crazy. I mean, you can have everything. Very often the owners are Greek, but very seldom you find Greek items on the menu, which is very interesting in itself. We go to the discourse of, the practices and the economic aspects of food and pop culture. So I'd like to start here from a very famous scene of When Harry Meets Sally, there at Katz Delicatessen, as you can read there. Let's see what happens, and then I'll offer my observations. And then, of course, there will be time for your observations. There will be time for Q&A, and I'm looking forward to it. Okay, we've probably seen this scene so many times, but I think that there are lots of elements that are interesting right there. First of all, the location, the diner. So the diner, well, it's not a diner, but it's true. It's literally not a diner. Okay, let's talk more about the restaurant then. In a sense that you can have certain foods that you order from a menu. You sit at your table and you can enjoy your food, and it's a part of everyday life here. While in other cultures, going out to eat, either to a diner or a restaurant, would be a special occasion because food is difficult to access. Sometimes we forget about that, but already the fact that the restaurant, the diner, has such an important role in our culture says a lot about who we are, as a matter of fact. So it's interesting. I think the scene here, it's mostly about, of course, the contrast about the two persons in terms of gender. And also in the way they relate to food, they show different aspects. The guy takes the sandwich, eats it as it is very sure about himself, as a man, also about his sexual abilities, let's say. She is much more complicated. I don't know if you remember in the movie, she always orders everything as she wants it precisely. And even in this scene, we can see how she basically takes the meat out of the sandwich. So she is, in a way, affirming her individuality. But on the other hand, she's adhering to the concept that women very often are not supposed to eat that much or that much meat. It's something that we find all over the place. Before working here at the New School, I also worked as a journalist for an Italian magazine, and I had to write a big story about wine bars. And I interviewed lots of patrons in wine bars, which turned out, and I mean, most of the patrons turned out to be women. So I found that interesting, and I started talking to them. How come you consider the wine bar as a good place for women to get together among friends and whatnot? Many of them pointed out to the fact that you can have little dishes that are not so big. So you have more control about what you eat. You can have as many little dishes as you want, but at the same time, you can control it better, and you're never seen eating a whole big dish of something. And I had not thought about that, frankly. Maybe not being a woman, I mean, you don't worry about the way people perceive you as you eat. But apparently it's something that also in very young generations is strong. So here she's asserting her individuality, but she's also performing a gendered role that is pretty common. And what I found interesting in this scene is that they break the barriers between two kinds of pleasures that are very often connected, which is eating and sex. Very often, you know, especially in pop culture, we see lots of reference to the fact that the body can become sort of an edible matter. It becomes sensual. And at the same time, food can give you pleasure just the same way sex can give it to you. These are metaphors very often. The power of the scene is in the fact that she actually goes beyond the metaphor and actually equates what she's eating with sexual pleasure somehow, to the point that the lady asks, oh, I want to have what she's having, because that's what the other ladies has perceived. Okay, there must be some really direct connection between that sandwich and her orgasm. This element of the connection between food and sexuality, it's really very strong and very present in American pop culture. And I wanted to show you something else. I have a big list here because there is so much that we could talk about. So I'm sort of going where the conversation leads me. Let's see. Okay, this is a piece that I often show to my students in class. And it's a video by Lady Gaga. I don't know if you're familiar with her. It's sort of big right now. And it's very interesting the way they use food in this specific video. Yeah, we have enough time. Oh, I have to sing that because it might be inappropriate. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, now there's the advertisement. YouTube is great to do research on pop culture, but you have to deal with lots of, it's pop culture. It's part of, selling and buying. I'll skip the first part, though, because basically she's in prison for some unknown reason. And finally she gets out. Let's see. We can skip this. And it goes on. But I think you've got the point, right? This was a very, very successful video. And I was very intrigued by the way food is used all over the place, even when it's not very visible. I don't know if you noticed, when she's in prison, she's got Diet Coke cans used as rolls, which it's already a strange element. But in a way, I think the whole video underlines lots of elements that have been used somehow to exploit women. I mean, the Diet Coke as, the desire to adhere to an ideal of the slim body, which, by the way, she has. So she's not having many problems there. But she's performing that presence of pop culture somehow directly in her hair. Then when they get together in the car, there is the honey bun and there is the fast food. So these are clearly women that are not afraid of their desire. They are voracious. They can eat and throw stuff. They represented as strong women. And as a matter of fact, the whole theme is sort of a Thelma and Louise narrative, right? Of course, here the car is the pussy wagon. But the concept is these women that are out for revenge. And they use precisely food, which very often is the tool through which women have been exploited for centuries. So here the food becomes the vengeance. It becomes poison. And the whole video is about that. You have this man who's voracious, clearly, and he expresses his voracity also in the relationship with the other people in the diner. The diner should be this space of wholesomeness, down-home cooking. It's all these elements of Americana repeated over and over, the flag and whatnot. So it should be a safe space where somehow traditions and way to be together are respected and upheld. It becomes the scene of a massacre, basically. The massacres in diners, as you might be aware, is a trope that it's used over and over in contemporary movies. Think about Pulp Fiction, From Dusk to Dawn. So very often, the place that should be a moment of relaxation becomes the place where either you're killed or you're eaten. So you become food. Here, the women use traditional foods, but also very much mass-produced food. We see Lady Gaga preparing her sandwich using Wonder Bread and what's the name? The whip, Miracle Whip, that I must admit so far I haven't tasted yet. But now I'm sort of intrigued by the commercials. I don't know if you've seen the new commercials. Which side are you on? And so I probably will have to take a side. I'm a little scared. But it's interesting how she's creating a massacre. The representation is framed in a very feminine genre, which is the recipe. Somehow it's filmed the same way a recipe would be filmed on the Food Network. You have the host with the different ingredients and the people around her, and she shows you what to do. There is even the little list of the ingredients. So the irony of the fact that a recipe becomes the tool of the massacre is underlined. And she's got telephones all over the place, which is interesting because, as you know, in New York, the telephone is the first tool of the kitchen, right? When you don't know what to do, you call. So I think there is also a reference to that. The way the man is depicted while eating food really underline this difference. He's there to get everything. But by doing that, he condemns himself to destruction. So I wanted to show you this because it's not particularly original, but it uses lots of elements that you see all over the place. And this is one of the interesting, fun, but also complicated elements when you deal with pop culture. You have to follow the track of elements that appears from a video to a cooking show to a supermarket. It never ends. The self-referentiality is one of the most important elements. So what I wanted to do today is just to show you some of the elements that could be interested, and probably you have tons of examples and ideas about that. And since it's 1:45, maybe we can start with questions. If you have any, I'd be happy to answer.
Yes, if you have a question, wait for the fellow with the mic to come to you. If you have any questions.
So just raise your hand if you have a question. Right.
First, let me say that I like Lady Gaga until I watched this film. I guess I'm kind of puzzled as to why that there was not information on screen about when she wore the meat dress at an award show. To me, that reflects so much of what she's about. And I guess this kind of video, which is one part of the observation, and the other part of the question was, this would appeal to students at the new school or any college university. It does not appeal to me. It's very offensive.
Oh, no, it doesn't appeal to students either.
Oh, really?
The students are very upset.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, good.
Absolutely. I
Thank
show,
you.
I show it to them because they very often they don't like the violence connected with the food, and the way in which these women who are supposedly taking revenge over men are actually the embodiment of men's desires in terms of attitudes and body image and whatnot. They have lots to say about this video. That's why sometimes I have them watch it and comment it. As for the meat dress, that's one of the interesting elements of pop culture I was referring to. It's probably not all there, but you're so immersed in pop culture that you immediately start doing connections. And for instance, for you, it was the meat dress. Maybe for other people in the audience could be other things, but it's sort of a chain that goes everywhere. So you see a little piece, and you have cultural references and quotes and hints all over the place. So that's actually a very good example.
Yeah, hi. In watching this and listening to you, I was thinking very much in terms of the totality of what Pierre Bourdieu would refer to as cultural capital. Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me that food today is so much an essential part of cultural capital, even here in more so here in New York,
yes,
that one really can't exist without being fully cognizant, even if you don't eat certain foods, of knowing the whole universe of what's going on in the other foodie universe, even if it's not your universe. And I wonder if you'd comment on that.
No, as you mentioned, cultural capital here in New York is basically fundamental to survive, apparently. Cultural capital is basically all the sort of knowledge and information that you can use to improve your social status or your position somehow. And here in New York is pretty much the case. You know, you can tell people, have you been to that new Thai restaurant that it's in Queens and nobody knows? By showing that knowledge, you increase your cultural capital. You go to a restaurant, you have, a 15-page wine list that looks endless, and you're able to pick the good value wine that is not too expensive, but the wine of which you know the origin, what's the grape, and what's the vintage, and you can show off about that. Much of the food center media are about also increasing cultural capital. Very often, when you watch cooking shows on TV, or you buy a cookbook, or you read the recipe on a paper, you're not really thinking about cooking it. There is another kind of enjoyment there, to the point that now there is a big discussion about the existence of food porn. Somehow the same... It's a serious discussion, actually, because from the media point of view, many of the elements of porn have been used to represent food. And there is this element of, I want to live through vicarious pleasure. So one of the pleasures that you get is actually the increase of your cultural capital. You know about galangal and its difference from ginger. And you can tell your friends, you should go to this little shop there that is not very well known yet, but you can find fresh galangal. If you want to have the dish, you have to go to that specific restaurant, Murray Hill, and so on and so forth. So the cultural capital is also very much part of these practices and narratives that become important for popular culture. Can we define it in terms of popular culture or high culture? I don't think it makes sense. It's one of the cases where it really doesn't make sense.
Many years ago, when some of us were growing up, the dinner table was the place that we gathered. And for holidays, we would have large gatherings. And of course, now, in 2011, this is no longer the scene. And I was wondering if you would discuss at all how this replacement of the gathering and food and have changed and
Well, I suspect that the gathering was always more of an ideological ideal rather than a reality, because we all know that, yes, we get together around big tables during the holidays, but that's when people get the knives out and go at each other. So there has been this very strong element of representation of the nuclear family around the table. I mean, Norman Rockwell has basically expressed this ideal through images. My question is, was it there? I mean, from a certain point of view, it was there because society was structured differently. The way people went to work, people went to shopping, were different. But there is also this element. And I found that this sort of ideal/ideological element is becoming very strong now. Many people, many young families now feel that somehow they have to get together around the table. Maybe they have to cook from scratch with fresh ingredients. It's very part of this ideal. I don't know if you've seen the show Weeds on Showtime. It's the story of this woman who loses her husband, and to maintain her family standards, starts dealing pot. And so she's a drug dealer. But at a certain point in one episode, she decided that her family has to sit together for a meal, because that's what families do. She cannot cook, so she started getting all sorts of convenience and crappy food, but she forces everybody to sit together and eat there. So I'm a little ambivalent in a way. I mean, I grew up in Italy in a big family where everybody got together every Sunday, and they still do. And when I'm there, I participate. And for me, it's normal when I want to have friends over to cook and share a meal. But that said, I'm not so convinced it was, the good old times as opposed to today as the projection that we have of what should have been rather than the reality. I don't know if...
Actually, I was just thinking of the popularity of all the Food Network and PBS programs maybe in the last 20 years or so. At the same time where women are so busy that they're not cooking. So I think it is like a remembrance, but not a real remembrance of what it used to be like sitting at the table, where, your siblings would fork you and you'd be having fights and stuff. But it's like this ideal that, we should be that way, so we should be doing this.
But now it's fashionable and trendy to be able to come back home, get to your Whole Food shop, get your good stuff and cook it and hopefully offer it to friends. So in a way, people had forgotten how to cook, but now they're trying to learn again because it's part of the cultural capital we're discussing. But the question is, who can afford that? Not everybody can afford that. So here we get into questions of gender, class, ethnicity, race. I mean, who has the time to go shopping after work and prepare a dinner from scratch? Some people do. Some people do it for a choice. Some people don't have that choice.
Or they could hire me. That's what I do for a living. I'm a personal chef.
Oh.
And you'd be surprised the information that you glean while you're listening in other people's homes and cooking for them. But they've done a lot of studies that show that families that eat together, no matter what they're eating, really, have slow foods is a good example of that, where you have just the idea of the family sitting there and talking.
But it's true, and I said I'm not against that.
Oh, no, I know,
absolutely.
but
But
it is
also,
coming back again.
what's family? It's the nuclear family with the mommy and the dad and the two kids.
No, it's friends from school, or if somebody isn't around, or
Exactly.
pick up randoms along the way. So not the old concept, but the new concept.
Very often in the past, the idea of the family meal was there to reinforce a whole set of gender structures and family structure and power structures that maybe somehow now are contested from inside. So you can have a whole bunch of gay men that get together to do their Sunday meal. Is that family? Probably it is, especially if you're in New York and you don't have anybody else around. So it's interesting how also this idea can be used and reinterpreted in more contemporary ways. Anybody?
Actually, what we're discussing is that food reflects so well the rapid changes in culture. What was exotic when I was growing up was a piece of pizza. I was eating Italy other than spaghetti. I understand that today sushi is fast becoming the most popular snack food in the United States, and at one point I heard that it overtook pizza. If you notice, if you want to go to a good restaurant and be very fancy, the plates are huge and the portions are small. They do a Jackson Pollock over the plate with some kind of gravy to give it class. And the changes, I happen to be a medical nutritionist by profession. My kids won't even eat in my house because everything is not organic, and they will only eat organic things. So this reflects so much the change, and I can't think of a better place than New York, where you say, I'm going to go out for dinner, let's have dinner. Where will we go? Thai, Chinese, Northern Chinese, Northern Italian, Southern Italian, you name it, Japanese. This, if we only got along as well personally as we do with blending our foods, this would be a great world.
That's true. That's a good observation. But I also want to point out that, yes, food is the reflection of the way society changed, but very often food itself is the engine of the changes. I mean, now we can do all this because we do have those foods. How do those foods get here? So that's one of the fascinating elements of pop culture. What determines what? You cannot tell. Is it society changing food, or there is something going on both ends?
My husband. Two more questions. My husband grew up.
Yes.
My husband grew up in a large Italian family, and he tells about the meals at Christmas where they would start at 12 o'clock and not leave the table till 7 o'clock. And when they did go to some of his relatives for Thanksgiving, I was incredulous because by the time the turkey came and you had gone through like literally 15 Italian dishes, there was no way you could eat it. And food had such a central part of their lives. Unfortunately, the whole generation except for him is diabetic, and I tell him the only reason he isn't, he's married to me, and we don't eat that way. But part of his family still eats that way for the holidays, and it's just like such a central part of their life that to me this is still incredible. And wonderful, wonderful food. And a lot of these people did not have much money, but they always had terrific food. They always ate well. He said when he was young, he ate beans and macaroni, not because it was good for you, but they couldn't afford the meat. They ate lentils and macaroni for the same reason. And nowadays, they can have the cheese and the, ravioli and stuff. But is it that important a role in Italy?
It is, but it's changing in Italy too very much because like anywhere else, there is not much time to spend in the kitchen. Like anywhere else, women do not feel that they have to be in the kitchen, and they do not feel they have to teach how to cook their daughters. So things are changing rapidly. That said, there are people in my generation who are going to cooking school to learn how to cook because their mothers and their grandmothers didn't teach them. So there is always this ambivalence. On one side, food is a way of improving your social life, but at the same time, it's very important for who you are. And Italy is a place where food does play a very, very important cultural role. Maybe that's why fast foods and ethnic foods have not become so pervasive. Although I must say now in Italy you can find Chinese restaurants and kebab restaurants everywhere. So that's changing too, actually.
Hi. Hello. Right here.
Okay.
I like the fact that we touched on the fact that your children will only eat organic food. I'm in the second row back here, so I'm sort of addressing you. Personally, I used to have a lot of dietary restrictions, and I still do. I used to be a vegan, and growing up in a home where a Jewish home where, like, if you don't touch the matzo ball soup, you're killing your grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to me how I was never very preachy, like, don't eat animals. It was just more, it's my choice not to eat this thing. Thank you, I'll abstain. And not just my family, but people that I was social with took such offense to that it was so abrasive that I made a choice not to eat simply chicken. There's a sort of, I feel like there are two schools of thought. There's, you have every right to not eat gluten, or you have every right to restrict, or, be picky. And then there are people who think that you are just being offensive to society by abstaining from eating, macaroni and cheese or
because
something.
I think the way we perceive our consumption has changed over time. Now we live in a society where what you consume and what you choose really determines also your identity as a person. While before, what you consumed would underline your belonging to a certain community. So the goal of your consumption and the underlying meaning has changed. And sometimes when you come from different positions, you don't understand the other's positions. And then I think that's my opinion where the tension comes from. It's something that we see all over the place, actually.